What's up, folks? After years of shooting and posting content for my RSX on YouTube, I finally decided to produce an everything you want to know video like I did for my Porsche Cayman on this channel. You may be thinking, what does DC5 represent in this channel's name? Well, DC5 is the Honda chassis code given to the Acura RSX, also known as the Honda Integra everywhere else in the world besides the United States and Canada. Regardless if you call it the RSX, DC5, or Integra, to me it represents my first sporty car I purchased back in February 2004, which sparked my car enthusiast hobby and interest in modifying cars, taking them to the track, and learning a little bit about what makes them tick. So, if you're an RSX subscriber, you're welcome. If you're a Porsche subscriber, pull up a chair. You might learn something other than how to pronounce PDK in German. And if you're new to the channel, get ready for one nerdy info dump on everything you want to know on somewhat forgotten little Honda gem. And now, without further ado, this is the DC5. This is the RSX. Most of the information in this video is going to be from me scouring the internet, owner's manual, and also my personal experience and knowledge of the car. If you think I got anything wrong, or if I might have forgotten some cool facts, just let me know down in the comments. I always appreciated Honda reliability and wanted a CRX back in the day, but never liked the look of the newer designs. In 2002, Honda unveiled the new DC5 Integra, which takes some design elements from a Civic EP3 hatch and former DC2 Integra, but with a very attractive fastback and sportier headlight and taillight design. After seeing this car at my local auto show, I planned on buying one new. Soon after, I purchased a Nighthawk Black 2004 Acura RSX Type S in 2004. This was the first new car I ever purchased, having only driven used cars before. Paid off the car in 2009 and have been upgrading and tuning ever since. After driving the car for many years, I found that it was very similar to my previous two-door Honda Accords I owned before, but much more fun to drive. That being said, the car is not without its shortcomings. If the RSX has an Achilles heel, it would be the lack of low-end stock torque and the move to use McPherson strut suspension instead of the superior wishbone design of the previous generation DC2 Integra. In addition to that, Honda made some very interesting choices when they engineered the steering rack, but more on that later. Even if the RSX has very little torque, a downgraded suspension, and a questionable steering rack, it feels more connected to the road by using a hydraulic steering rack and a cable-based throttle control compared to many manufacturers moving to drive-by-wire systems of today. Let's start with history. The Acura RSX was introduced in Japan in April 2001 to replace the previous third-generation Acura Integra. Production began in July of 2001 and ended in August of 2006. Model years include 2002 through 2006. The first versions were built between 2002 and 2004, while the facelift revision models include 2005 and 2006 production years. So what kind of car is the RSX? Well, like its predecessor, the Integra, you can call it a two-door coupe, you can call it a 2+2 seater, which means it seats two in the front, two in the back seat, or you can call it a sporty coupe hatchback. Okay, enough with a history lesson. Let's get down to business and talk about one of the most interesting aspects of the car, the engine. The RSX was one of the first Honda-produced cars to include the infamous K-motor, the K20. The base RSX was equipped with a K20A3, which had an output of 160 horsepower and 142 foot-pounds of torque. This K20A2 variant is a 2-liter, 4-stroke, 4-cylinder, 16-valve, and 2 overhead cam engine. The motor is mostly comprised of an aluminum block with cast iron sleeves. It produces more power than the K20A3 version because the VTEC, which uses a second cam profile at specific RPM, operates at both the intake and the exhaust camshaft, while the base K20A3 only uses VTEC on the intake camshaft. Variants of the K motor can be found in current Honda production cars, like the K20C1 found in the FK8 10th generation Civic Type R. Now let's take a quick detour and talk about one of the technical terms I mentioned before, VTEC. For those new to Honda engines or living under a rock, what is VTEC? VTEC stands for Variable Valve Timing and Lift Control. The RSX K20 has an I in front of VTEC, or iVTEC, and this stands for intelligent. The I in iVTEC is different than the old VTEC because it adds what Honda refers to as the VTC system. The VTC is described as an intake camshaft automatically self-adjusts the cam gear, which continuously optimizes valve overlap for all RPM ranges. Right. In layman's terms, when running at low RPMs, the engine is docile and fuel efficient. But when the gas pedal hits the floor and the RPMs increase, the engine transforms to an unruly hooligan. Need more information? Feel free to search the internet for VTEC meme. I'll wait. All this talk about valves got me thinking of another fact. The K20 is also known as an interference engine. This is when one or more valves can extend into any area of the cylinder where the piston may travel. The engine's timing chain controls when and where the valves or the pistons occupy this space. The timing chain is very important, and when the timing chain fails, bad things can happen to your K20. Ask me how I know. Let's review some of the K20 invariants. We have a K20A high-performance engine, which can be found in the Honda Integra Type R in Japan. It's also found in the Accord and some Civic models in Japan. It has a compression of 11.5 to 1 and reaches power of about 220 horsepower. Honda equipped the K20A3 in the base model of the RSX. The iVTEC is only present in the intake camshaft with no lift, duration, or timing on the exhaust camshaft like the K20A2. This gives the engine 160 horsepower and 141 pound-feet of torque. As mentioned before, my premium Type S model is a K20A2, sold between 2002 and 2004. Its block is comprised of aluminum alloy, has 16 valves, iVTEC, 4 cylinders, and is 2 liters. Has 200 brake horsepower at 7,400 RPM and 142 pounds of torque at 6,000 RPM. The red line is 7,900 RPM. The compression is 11.0 to 1, multi-point or port fuel injection, and dual overhead cams. For the 2005 to 2006 RSX Type S model, Honda replaced the K20A2 engine with the K20Z1. This engine received a modest bump in power from 200 horsepower to 210 horsepower, and the torque increased from 142 pounds-foot to 143. The difference in power between the K20A2 and K20Z1 is attributed to slightly better camshafts for the Z1, and the transmission final drive increased to 4.7 from the 4.39 in the A2. With all this talk about differences between the Type S and the base RSX, what are the visual differences? My Type S came with leather seats, a 6-disc Bose system including head unit, with amp and a subwoofer mounted in the spare tire under the floor in the trunk. All this came as standard equipment. As for the badging, there's only 2 I can think of. There's a tiny Type S badge on the right side of the rear trunk lid, and the Type S badge on the floor mats, which I never used because I bought the option for the all-weather factory floor mats, which I highly recommend. The most notable visual difference between the Type S and the base are in the equipped transmissions between the two. The shift knob in the base shows either a 5-speed or an automatic shift pattern, and the Type S should have the 6-speed shift knob because it was only equipped with a 6-speed manual transmission. The visual differences between the 02 to 04 years of the car and the 05 to 06 facelift are a little bit easier to see. The teardrop style headlights of the 02 to 04 models were redesigned in the 05-06. The taillights in the 05 and 06 models show a slightly raised surface compared to the flat face of the older model of the 02-04. The gauge cluster and the facelift models received a glossy white look, which replaced the titanium gray of the first versions. Now let's briefly discuss the suspension. As I mentioned before, Honda replaced the double wishbone suspension in the third generation Integra to the McPherson struts in the front for the fourth generation RSX. Although Honda replaced the double wishbone in the front, they retained the double wishbone for the rear suspension. It also has independent rear suspension trailing arms, a 23mm tubular front sway bar, and a 19mm solid rear sway bar. What's safety like in the RSX? Like most cars at the time, the RSX is equipped with driver and passenger dual-stage airbags, driver and passenger seat belts, 2 more seat belts for the 2 passengers in the rear, and anti-lock brakes or ABS. Since so much of safety relies on the braking system, let's discuss the rest of the braking specifications. The RSX Type S has 11.8-inch front rotor size, or 300 millimeters, and 10.2-inch rear brake rotor size, or 260 millimeters. The RSX has single-piston calipers for the front and rear. Several years ago, I sold my Type S rotors to another RSX base owner on eBay. In the item's description, I told the buyer that the size was the same, the rotors should fit on the base. Unfortunately for the buyer, they emailed me back and told me that the rotors did not fit, so I gave them a full refund, told them to keep the rotors. It turns out that the size of the calipers and the brake master cylinder is slightly different between the base and the Type S. For the base, it's a 7/8, and for the Type S is a 15/16. At the time of initial production, the RSX received a 4-star out of 5 NHTSA or NHTSA crash test rating. Specifically, it received a 5-star rating for front, driver, and passenger impact, and a 4-star rating for side impacts. On a side note, one of the reasons the RSX looks different from the previous version of the Integra is from the larger A-pillars found on either side of the windshield. This not only gives the chassis more structural rigidity, but also helps protect the occupants in the event the car rolls over. Okay, for all you super geeky Honda nerds out there, let's discuss the specs. And for everyone else, I've got a really fun segment after this discussing all the facts of the RSX over the years. Let's start with the performance specs. I think I read somewhere back in the day the RSX Type S doing 0 to 60 in 6.5 seconds. Although Car and Driver clocked the Type S in at 6.8 seconds to get to 60 miles per hour. The standing quarter mile was completed in 15.4 seconds at 93 miles per hour. Top speed is reached at 142 miles per hour. 70 to 0 braking distance was measured in at 175 feet, and the Type S circled the 300-foot skid pad at 0.88 Gs. What are the dimensions of the RSX? The length, 173 inches, or 4,395 millimeters. The width, 67.9 inches, or 1,725 millimeters. Height, 55.1 inches, or 1,400 millimeters. The wheelbase is 101.2 inches, or 2,570 millimeters. And the tracked front to rear is 58.3 inches, or 1,482 millimeters. Now the curb weight is where it gets a little fishy. A lot of different internet sites report different things for the curb weight. Now the curb weight, as far as I know, is defined as the car, including all of its fluids included, or curb weight for what the car would weigh on the street. Honda reports the curb weight as being 2,778 pounds for the Type S, or 1,260.08 kilograms, while Acura's site reports 2,694 pounds. My guess is maybe Acura was only measuring the regular weight without the fluids. For comparison, a third-party independent site weighed the Type S in at 2,840 pounds. Regardless of all of this, the Type S still remains a very light car compared to modern cars made today. How does this factor into the weight distribution? Since the RSX is a front-engine, front-wheel drive car, most of this weight is unfortunately up front. The 6-speed Type S manual is 63% up front, 37% of the weight in the rear. 5-speed manual base is 64 in the front, 36 in the rear, and the automatic is 60 in the front and 40% in the rear. Now let's talk about those fluid capacities in MPG. The RSX has a 13.2 gallon fuel capacity tank, gives it 24 miles in the city and 31 highway miles. It has 4.8 quarts of oil, including the filter, uses 5W30 motor oil, has 1.8 quarts of manual transmission fluid, yet when you replace the manual transmission fluid, it only requires 1.6 quarts. Because of the RSX high compression engine, it requires 91 octane or better premium gas. Tires and wheels. The RSX Type S is equipped with 16-inch 5-spoke 16 by 6.5 inch lightweight alloy aluminum wheels as standard. Acura offered a 17-inch A-spec wheel as an option. The stock tire size is 205, 55, 16 on all 4 wheels. This is also known as a square tire setup. Acura recommends to inflate the front tires to 33 pounds per square inch and then the rear tires to 31 pounds per square inch. Steering specs. The RSX is equipped with a variable power assist rack and pinion hydraulic steering rack. It's 15.1 to 1 ratio with a 38.1 foot turning circle radius. The RSX shares a steering rack setup the same as 3 other Honda models. Can you guess which ones? I'll mention it later in the facts section. In my opinion, the steering rack is unfortunately one of the major drawbacks of this platform. Let me explain. In the RSX and 3 other Honda model platforms, the steering rack is mounted higher than other cars and moves on the firewall instead of being fixed. This compromises suspension geometry and increases bump steer, which becomes more pronounced if the car is lowered using aftermarket parts. Fortunately, inverted tie rods, roll center adjusting ball joints, and a rigid steering rack slider can greatly reduce the compromised suspension geometry. Unfortunately, this is not cheap. As I mentioned before, the RSX Type S is equipped with a 6-speed manual transmission as standard equipment. It has brass synchronizers and is equipped with an open differential. Gear ratios are as follows. First gear is 3.267, second gear is 2.13, third gear is 1.517, fourth gear is 1.147, fifth gear is 0.921, and the sixth gear is 0.738, with a final drive of 4.389. As we're wrapping up this deep dive on the RSX, let's go over some fun facts. There's some discussion online about what the acronym RSX means. Some sources say it stands for Rally Sport Experimental. Just like the 3rd generation DC2 Integra, Honda produced a Type R variant for the 4th generation in Japan, which was lighter, equipped with stiffer springs and shocks, HID projector headlights, aluminum pedals, 4-piston Brembo brakes, and a K20A engine, not to be confused with a K20A2 found in the Type S. This K20A produced 217 horsepower. Due to its compact size, strength, and relative low cost, the K20 and K24 engines are popular engine swaps for all sorts of non-Honda cars, from the Lotus Elise, Toyota MR2, young and old Mini Coopers, the ubiquitous Mazda Miata, and recently even in a Porsche 911. The RSX K20 power plant was also used in the track car known as the Ariel Atom, which was later supercharged and supplanted with the 2.4-liter variant, the K24. As mentioned before, this 4th generation of the Integra was the first to feature McPherson struts, replacing the superior double wishbone suspension in the previous Integra. It is also equipped with a throttle cable compared to the S2000 and later Hondas using drive-by-wire system. Remember when I mentioned the RSX shares the steering rack with 3 other Honda platforms? These cars include the CR-V, Civic EP3, and the Element. Approximately 130,000 RSX models were sold between 2001 and 2006. The highest bid for a used RSX on Bring a Trailer was $23,000 for a 2006 Type S with 41,000 miles in 2001. Ironically, this was the same price of a new Type S in 2006. The RSX has received many positive reviews and accolades over the years, and was also named one of Car and Driver's 10 best cars in 2002 and 2003. Although I don't recall seeing the RSX appear as a hero car in an action movie, you could still find the car in popular modern video games such as Forza, Forza Horizon, and the Gran Turismo series. Well, that wraps up this deep dive on the RSX. Do you have any interesting specs or fun facts I didn't mention in the video? Feel free to mention it in the comments below. Later this year, I may do a video walk around on my personal RSX, describing some of its quirks and features and the modifications I've performed over the years. Until then, remember this important Honda proverb: VTEC just kicked in, yo.